The next seam finish we're going to work on is the Hong Kong bias bound seam finish. We're going to need the 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern. You're going to need 2 cut from muslin. Remember to align your grain line, copy your internal lines, and clip your notches. I have copied my internal line with my friction pen by drawing a stitch line 3/4 inch in from the raw edge. Again, 3/4 inch is 6 of these tiny little squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I've drawn my stitching line on 2 pieces of muslin, and I've clipped my notches at the top and at the bottom. Got a little notch clipped in there. You will also need 1/4 inch double fold bias tape. And it should look something like this when you get it out of the package. I have made my own bias tape. You cut a strip of fabric at a 45-degree angle on true bias, 1 inch wide, and then you can fold it on itself towards the center like that. Fold the 2 long edges towards the center, and you can fold it again on itself to make a 1/4 inch wide folded piece of bias tape. So again, you can see, come on, focus. And then you can see here, this was just a 1 inch wide piece of bias cut fabric, pressed in towards the center, and then pressed again to fold. You're welcome to make your own bias tape if you'd like, but store-bought is going to be just as reliable, just as accurate, and a lot faster. The first thing you want to do to prepare for this seam sample is cut your bias tape. So you'll probably have a package of bias tape, and it'll come on a piece of cardboard, wound around a piece of cardboard. Unwind a few inches of it and measure it along your muslin sample. You're going to want a little bit of extra fabric to hang off of either end to make it a little bit easier to work with. And clip it with about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch extended on either end. You're going to need 2 pieces of these. I'm going to cut my other piece of bias fabric here similarly. There we go. And then, if you have store-bought bias tape and it's all folded up, you're going to want to take this to the iron, unfold it, and press it flat as best you can. Now with store-bought bias tape, folded bias tape, it's going to be very difficult to get the creases out of this. That's okay. We want some creases in there. It's going to help later when we go to sew this. We can use it as a seam guide. But press it as best you can and get it as flat as you can. Just don't force it, because those creases are going to be difficult to take out. I'm going to take this to my ironing board. I'm going to open this up and press this as flat as I can get it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pressed it as flat as I can. If I zoom in, you may still see some of the creases stuck in there, but that's totally fine. So just as we did for the turned and stitched sample, I'm going to take my 2 pieces of muslin with my stitch lines marked. I'm going to place them with the stitch marks facing out. So I should be able to see the stitch marks facing up towards me. If I turn this over, again, the stitch marks are facing away, because this will mark the wrong side of our fabric. Align my notches, make sure those notches are lined up. I'm going to grab my pins, pin this together, pin it perpendicular to the stitching line, pinning through all the layers. So that's ready to go. And then I'm going to head to my sewing machine and stitch my seam. 3, 2, 1, mark. So here at my sewing machine, I'm going to lift up my foot, place my 2 pieces of muslin underneath, lower my foot, lower my needle, take 2 steps, 2 stitches forward, hold down my reverse lever, take 2 stitches back, and stitch my seam together while removing my pins. Need to realign my fabric here a little bit. And as I get to the end of my seam, I will walk my stitches. And again, 2 stitches back, holding down my reverse lever. And 2 stitches forward. Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up. Lift my presser foot, remove my work, and snip my threads at the beginning and at the end so I have a nice finished seam. Take this to the iron and press the seam open. Got my work here on the ironing board. Again, I'm going to kind of tug the 2 edges apart. Do a bit of a finger press. Please excuse my iron. Just to get this nice and flat, making sure there's no pieces rolling under themselves. And press that flat with a good deal of steam. Give it a look-see, make sure it's nice and clean on the wrong side, the inside of the garment, and the outside of the garment. I'm going to go over to my workstation and start to finish these seams off. So back on my work surface, here we've got yet another seam, same as what we had with our turned and stitched sample. But instead of turning and stitching these seam allowances down, we're now going to use that bias tape that we pressed out to clean finish these edges. Just as we did before, I'm going to pinch my rightmost seam allowance, just the seam allowance, lift everything up, and pull everything else to the left, to my left-hand side. So I've got both layers of fabric, of muslin here, and the other side of my seam allowance, and I've got my rightmost seam allowance here. I've got some extra threads I gotta cut off here. Clean that up as much as I can. And I'll grab one of these pieces of bias tape that I've pre-cut and align one of the long raw edges of the bias tape to the raw edge of my seam allowance. Now my bias tape, because it's made out of printed fabric, has a right and a wrong side. So you can see this side is more saturated with ink, while the wrong side doesn't have quite as much ink saturation. If you have a store-bought piece of bias tape, you may not have a discernible right and wrong side. You may see a few bias cut seam allowances on the inside, and that will indicate the wrong side of your bias tape. If not, when you went to press it out, the sides that want to curl in towards them, so if I'm looking at this facing me, if they're wanting to curl in and fold themselves, this would be the wrong side of the bias tape. So you want to place this matching these raw edges. Again, with your bias tape, it should want to kind of fold back up onto itself in this direction. So that's the correct orientation for your bias tape. And I'm going to pin this in place. I am pinning through the bias tape and my seam allowance. Again, aligning the raw edges. Here, I'll zoom in here. Aligning the raw edges of the bias tape with the raw edge of the seam allowance, pinning through just the bias tape and the seam allowance. I haven't caught anything else over here. I don't have any of this caught. I don't have any of my other seam allowance caught in there. Just the bias tape and the seam allowance. And again, the right side of my bias tape is facing down towards my seam allowance. So it wants to fold up towards me. Going back to the sewing machine, and we'll stitch this in place. Now, if you're using store-bought bias tape, you should still see these little creases in your bias tape even after you've ironed them down. You can use that as a seam guide to stitch right in that fold, so your stitches should follow along that fold. If you're using homemade bias tape and you may or may not have those creases, they may not be as easy to see, you want to use, we're going to be sewing at a scant, we're going to be sewing at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, so a little bit shy of a 1/4 inch. And you're going to want to align the raw edges of your fabric and bias tape along the edge of your presser foot. Again, you can stitch in this folded groove, and you can also try to align the raw edges to the side of your presser foot. I'm going to align to the side of my presser foot, so it'll give me a slightly narrower seam allowance. I want to start, I know I have excess bias tape up here, I want to start somewhere around the level where my muslin is, because I don't want to sew the bias tape by itself. I'm trying to sew the two together. Remember, all my extra fabric is over here on the left hand side, so I'm just going through the bias tape and the seam allowance, my rightmost seam allowance. 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, and then stitch all the way through using this as my seam guide. I'm going to check every once in a while to make sure both edges are still aligned. Removing my pins as I go. As I get near the end, I know that my muslin is about to end over here, so I'm going to slow down, walk my last few stitches. Again, I don't want to stitch too far off of my muslin. I don't need to stitch all the way down there. 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward. Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, raise my presser foot, remove my work, snip my threads. At the beginning and at the end. So I have sewn my bias tape to my seam allowance on one side, one of my seam allowances. Again, I want to make sure I'm not stitching too far off of my muslin. So I'm using the other side of my muslin to gauge where I start and where I stop, right around there. I'm going to take this to the iron and press this flat and then fold it over that raw edge of my seam allowance there. So let's go to the iron. Okay, at the iron, again, here's what it looks like from the outside of the garment, quote unquote outside, and the inside. Still got my seam allowance that was pressed open, and now that raw edge of the seam allowance lined up with the raw edge of the bias tape, stitched in place. I'm now going to turn this bias tape nice and flat. I'm going to isolate my seam allowance here. Just pick this up, pinch everything together, push everything else out to the opposite side, and press this nice and flat. I'm going to kind of tug and pull my bias tape a little bit, just kind of tug it a little bit just so it lies nice and flat. We don't want it to curl up and under itself. We want this seam to be nice and flat here. So already we're starting to get a nice clean finish along this edge. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. So this is what it looks like on the inside of the garment. If I flip this over, you can see the remaining raw edge of my seam allowance. I'm now going to fold my bias tape over that raw edge. Now I don't want this raw edge to curl up on itself, so I don't want to roll it too tight. I'm using the raw edge as my guide for where I need to fold my bias tape. I'm going to fold that bias tape right over that raw edge, and again press that in place. I want to make sure that my fold is uniform. I don't want to end up with a 1/4 inch wide fold here and a 1/2 inch wide fold over here, something that's really wide down here at the bottom. So I just want to make sure that fold stays uniform from one end of my seam to the other. Set it with some steam. There we go. So we're getting a nice clean finish on that raw edge. And we've got our excess binding over here. I'm going to go grab my pins. And I'm going to pin through all my layers. I'm going to pin from this side because I'm going to end up stitching from this side. And I'm going to end up sewing through this one more time, right along this edge. So again, I'm pinning perpendicular to where I'm sewing. And I'm pinning through the bias binding and the muslin fabric, pinning through all layers. I'm making sure I catch this bias binding underneath as well. There we go. Everything pinned in place. Nice even fold on my bias tape. Everything's pinned on the other side. And I'm going to go back to my sewing machine. Now back at my sewing machine, I'm going to do a method called stitch in the ditch. Now in this case, the ditch is referring to this little section right here. Just to the left of my bias binding, I'm going to stitch right along that fold where I've pressed my bias binding out. I don't want to go too far on top of the bias binding unless I'm using a corresponding thread, which I'm not at this point. And I want to keep the stitches as uniform as possible, as straight as possible. We're just in between these two pieces of fabric. So I'm going to raise my presser foot. Again, I'm just going through the seam allowance. I still have the rest of my fabric over here on the left-hand side. Raise my presser foot, place my work underneath, and before I lower my foot, I'm going to lower my needle first to make sure I have it exactly where I want it, just to the left of my bias tape. So it's going to stitch right along this fold here. Lowering my foot, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, and stitch on through, removing the pins as I go. I'm going to move very slowly to make sure I keep my stitches aligned to that fold of my bias tape. Oh, I went a little too far over my bias tape there. I still need some practice. Again, as I get near the end of my sample, lock my stitches, 2 stitches back, 2 stitches forward, Make sure my take-up lever is all the way up. Raise my presser foot, remove my work, snip my threads. Snipping threads at the beginning and the end of my stitching. And if you have a corresponding thread to your bias tape or to your fabric, these stitches are almost imperceptible to anyone who wouldn't know to look for them. So they should be right up against that fold. Again, stitch in the ditch. And if I turn this over, you should see that the rest of that bias tape has gotten caught in that stitching. So it keeps this bias binding from rolling and coming off of this edge, and now we have a nice clean finish to our seam allowance. We can now trim off this excess bias binding. And give ourselves a nice clean finish for one of our seam allowances. I'm going to do the exact same thing on this seam allowance. Again, pinching my leftmost seam allowance, pulling the rest of the sample over to my right so I can isolate just this piece of fabric. And I'll do the exact same thing, lining up my bias tape, stitching it in place. I'm not going to talk through every step, but I will show you the same thing over again if you need to see that one more time. So here is one finished side. Pinch my leftmost seam allowance, pull everything else to my right, take my bias tape and align those raw edges. Now I work best when everything is on my right, so I'm just gonna turn this around and repeat the same process. Pinning the raw edges together. Now I'll take this to my machine and sew using the edge of my presser foot as a seam guide. Making sure my take-up lever is all the way up. Raise my presser foot, remove my work, snip my threads. I'll take this to the iron. Press this bias tape open, putting all the excess seam allowance towards the bias tape. Just going to fold that open and press it, and then wrap the bias tape around that raw edge. to the back, press it again, pin it in place, and then come back to the machine to stitch it. So again, bias tape, which had been laying like this, stitched into place, pressed nice and flat, all the excess seam allowance going towards the bias tape. Oh my goodness. So all this excess seam allowance going out towards the right, towards the bias tape. Fold that bias tape over that raw edge, pin it in place through all the layers, all the way down. And then I will stitch in this little ditch. I'm going to lower my needle first to make sure my needle is in the proper alignment. 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. Towards the end, locking my stitches, 2 stitches back to reinforce, and 2 stitches forward. Make sure my take-up lever's all the way up, raise my foot, remove my work, snip my threads at the beginning and the end. So yet again, stitch in the ditch, right along that fold in the bias tape. On focus. There we go. Just going to trim the excess bias tape from either end. I'm using my fingers to support my scissors. If you are unable to cut flat on the table for whatever reason, please use your fingers to support your scissors. So again, our seam should look like any other seam from the outside. With my muslin, you can see a little bit of fabric through that, but if this were an opaque fabric, you would never know that there was a seam finish until you turn this over. And you see bias bound, Hong Kong bias bound seam finishes on either side with our stitch in the ditch and the rest of our bias tape secured by that stitching underneath. So this is the Hong Kong bias bound seam finish.